decide to make it. She's right
Well,
here, so I'm trying to
if
get
she-
her out of the room.
If she does, it just adds great humor to what we do together. There she is.
Babs.
She's adorable.
Say hi, Babs.
Oh, she's so adorable.
She has a tendency to walk on the keyboard.
Is she like a specific breed, or is she like a mixed?
My daughter lives downstate, and this was one of the barn cat births.
Oh, cute.
So we rescued her from feral barn cat to house cat as a little kitten.
No, that's cute. She's pretty.
Well, I know people are joining us, so I'm so welcome everyone. We're all excited to have you all join us today. So we'll get started in just a few minutes.
I have just about a minute left on my clock. So if any of our panelists, if you want to take yourself off of camera, and you please feel free. Those of you who are just joining us, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat, we'd love to hear, who you are, what brought you here, where you're joining us from. That would be great. So feel free to talk to us in the chat there. And I think that brings us right to 9:30 Central Time. So Dr. Martin, I'm going to hand things over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Margie Martin, and I serve as the campus dean of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Our campus has the privilege of partnering with the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute. So we're using Zoom webinar today, so participants will not be able to share their video or unmute themselves, but we welcome you to engage with our presenters by asking questions in the Q&A box or placing comments in the chat box. For those of you who want to earn continuing education credits today, you must attend the entire conference, and about an hour after the conclusion of the conference, you'll get a link to a short quiz to demonstrate your learning and a brief program evaluation. Our topic today is so relevant and has affected so many people in challenging ways. We did provide some mental health information in the brochure and on our Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute website, and we'll put that in the chat box in just a couple minutes. And so now I want to turn it over to the founders of our Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute, Marilyn and Larry Cohen, who will officially welcome you to our 19th Community Conference, NRCI Conference. So Larry and Marilyn, take it away.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 19th Community Mental Health Conference. We started these conferences in 2002 was our first conference. And the subject of that conference was bipolar. Now, we knew at that time that there were, bipolar was affecting maybe 1 in 100 Americans, but 3/4 of the people who were being affected by bipolar were not getting any type of treatment. I mean, think about that. If we had a physical ailment, whether it be a heart condition or a back problem, and 3/4 of the people were not getting any treatment, that would have been a national scandal. And we thought something needed to be done about it. Well, the villain was stigma. Stigma was what was preventing people from getting treatment. Let me quote from the Surgeon General in his report that came out that year on mental illness. He said, the foremost barrier to treatment is the stigma that many in our society attach to mental illness and to many and to people who have a mental illness. Stigma tragically denies people their dignity and interferes with their full participation in society. It must be overcome. Well, what do we mean by stigma? I mean, from our experience, stigma was internal in many people who have mental health problems. It was the feeling of, why is this happening to me? What is happening? I'm all alone here. I don't understand why I'm going to be in this problem. Maybe it's going to go on for the rest of my life. I don't know how to handle this. Or it can be external. I mean, what do I tell my friends or my family or my mate or my employer that I'm now getting treatment for mental illness? They're not going to understand it. They're not going to appreciate it. They're not going to accommodate me. So stigma was a terrible problem. We as a fledgling minuscule mental health institution thought we needed to do something to overcome that problem. The two prongs really that we thought would be helpful would be education. enlightening people about what mental illness was and why it was affecting, and so people could understand what was happening to themselves and all those who were impacted by mental illness. Second, we would get people together in a common place so they could meet other people who were similarly affected, and people who could be professionals and could give them help and assistance and support. And the way to do that, we believe, was through a conference which would bring together people who were experts in the field, people who had themselves had the problem, professionals and non-professionals alike. It would be diverse population from the whole community that was being affected. Bring these people together in a safe and a welcoming environment, so that they could learn from each other, have both a spiritual and a secular component, have a minimum cost. And that's really what we've been trying to do through the years through our 19 conferences. Now, I recognize today, because we're having a virtual conference, we're going to miss some features that we've had in past conferences. We can't have breakout sessions, for example, where we try to explore all these issues in greater detail. We can't have exhibits by our sponsors and by mental health groups that will enlighten us about what they do and how they can provide help. But most of all, we're going to miss the camaraderie that we've had in the past, getting all together, talking about our situations, each one of us learning from the other about how to deal with the problems that we're facing. And Marilyn and I are going to miss meeting a lot of the people who we get to meet at these conferences and get to know more. So we know it's not the same thing, but it was. And next year we're really anticipating we're going to be able to do an in-person hearing and have all those components. But having a conference this year was really important for us. When we started planning for the conference last year, the 2020 conference, we knew that 2020 was going to be a difficult year. It was going to be an election year. There was partisanship going on. We had problems with the economy, with China. It was going to be a stressful year. So we picked for the subject for the 2020 conference, stress and anxiety. Well, by the time we came to conference time in the spring, those problems have been multiplied many times. The stress was far more than we could have imagined. But at the same time, we couldn't put on the conference because of the COVID restrictions. And we were frustrated because here we wanted to put on a conference, but we couldn't do anything to help the situation except some non-conference activities. This year we decided, we being our past executive director, Kate Mahoney, the conference planning committee, the one who does all the work of getting speakers and helping us plan the conference, the school, Margie and Michelle and Michael Horowitz, everybody felt we had to put on a conference this year to provide whatever we could, even though it was imperfect, to address the problems that have arisen of stress and anxiety over the past year. I mean, when it came down to it, simply, this was the most stressful, difficult mental health period that most of us had known. Certainly one of the most devastating in American history. We were a mental health institution, and we could not sit by the sidelines and be benign and ignore what was going on. We had to do whatever we could. So that's why we're here today. We're here to provide, through the generosity and through the expertise of our speakers, to provide whatever education we can, to try to help in any way we can, because that's what we're all about at the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute. I hope it's going to be a beneficial and enjoyable morning, I guess I was going to say afternoon, morning for all of us. Let me share one piece of very good news, though. We have hired, effective last week, a new executive director. We are fortunate to have someone, Tracy Levine, who has a great background in business, a great background in professional activities. She's going to be president-elect of the Mental Health of the North Shore. She worked, well, I have a whole resume here. I could spend a lot of time. but she was, get it here, former executive director of the Women's Treatment Center of Chicago, a former vice president of foster care at Lawrence Hall. And well, speaking on a professional note, she has her BA in MSW from the University of Michigan, which is personally valuable to me. I know she knows then the joys and sorrows of following Wolverine athletics. So that's another plus in her favor. Anyway, I think, Tracy, can you come on and wave to everyone? There's Tracy. Tracy, we're looking forward to working with you. We know it's going to be onward and upward for the Institute, and many joys and pleasures in the years ahead.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning, everyone.
All right. The conference today is really an honor and a memory of our past executive director, our late Kate Mahoney. And I'm going to ask Marilyn if she would step in and tell us a few of her thoughts about and reminiscences about Kate.
Good morning, everybody. Old friends, new friends, and people who I hope to see next year in person at the conference, as we all do. And you have a picture on your screen of Kate. Kate was particularly dear to me, and I'm going to talk mostly about my personal feelings about her. She has a huge tent of wonderful activities and connections and so forth, but you'll read about that or hear about that don't touch elsewhere. What I want to talk about is the many hours that I spent with her, both in having lunch or breakfast with her with just the two of us, occasionally with Larry, occasionally with a small group, but primarily in our planning committee. Our planning committee began at the very beginning with a group of professionals who we learned of sort of indirectly and somewhat through our synagogue, where our first number of conferences took place. In this planning committee, Kate came on very quickly. She was one of the early participants, and we had meeting after meeting after meeting. 80% of the time I spent with her was in a planning committee, and her presence there struck such a chord for me, and I'll always remember the quality of her presence. Presence is one thing, but the quality of Kate's presence was like no other. She almost never missed a meeting, whether she was there before she was executive director or after, it didn't even make any difference. She was just so present. When people spoke, she looked at them, she listened to them, she never forgot anything that they said. She had a quality of helping us brainstorm so that people were saying things in the room that they never even knew they thought. She created a brainstorming environment. Other people in the group helped her do that, but I thought that she was the consummate organizer of the atmosphere in the room that came to feel like we were all friends and family, and we were not scared to say anything. We weren't afraid of being dumb or repetitious or talking too long. We just were okay in that room with her planning. And we did a lot of planning throughout the year. We started without knowing what we were doing, and we ended up with 6, 7, 8 meetings over the course of the year until finally we had the whole conference put together beautifully. And then afterwards we celebrated, evaluated, and started thinking about the following year. But I don't ever remember Kate not being there. Also not being there in her Kate way of being there, which was, as I said earlier, almost unlike no other. And that's pretty much what I want to say about her. And I'm going to rest with that. And those of you who knew her know that I am speaking directly from the truth here. And those of you who did not know her, I assure you that somewhere in your world, she has had an impact.
Thanks, Marilyn. It's now my pleasure, my honor to introduce the next speaker. As I mentioned, in our conferences, we try both to deal with the spiritual element and the secular element. And this year, the spiritual element is very important because we have with us a prominent a very valued member of the Evanston clergy, someone who has been prominent this year because we're dealing not only with his people in his parish who suffer from COVID or were affected by COVID, but with the racial tensions that went on in our community, the efforts to try to work together and find a common ground. I'm talking now about Pastor Michael Neighbors from Second Baptist Church in Evanston. It's what, 139-year-old institution. And Pastor Neighbors, I know, has worked with people throughout the community during the year. We're really honored and pleased to have him as our speaker. So thank you, Pastor Neighbors.
Yes. Thank you so much, Larry. And I want to say good morning to you and Marilyn, and thank you so much for the introduction. And of course, everything that you do for the community through the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute has been a tremendous blessing for those of us in the Metro Chicago area. So I'm really grateful for that. Also grateful for you lifting up and remembering Kate Mahoney, who was also well-loved in the Evanston community, and a wonderful and warm and gracious congratulations to the new executive director as she comes in to take charge. I'd like to talk for just a few minutes from the vantage point of a local pastor regarding how we have managed to deal with grief and stress during a global pandemic. There are several areas that I want to cover, but the first one, of course, is something that is germane to everybody that is on the call and everybody that's listening in and looking on. The first thing that we had to do in March of last year is we had to immediately adjust to a new reality. And that alone often creates a significant amount of stress in just about every normal human being. And that, of course, was when our society and our community had to literally shut down for a few months. For those of us at Second Baptist and the faith community in Evanston overall, we shut our doors the second Sunday of March. And most of these houses of worship did not have in-person worship experiences or meetings until very recently. So it was over a year and generally almost 15 months before people began to gather together, and they're just doing that right now. So what did we do? How did we find ways to help people deal with isolation and separation that caused undue stress? And then, of course, the reality of COVID-19 creating death in our communities as well. Handling the day-to-day issues was a challenge. But one of the things that was advantageous for us in Evanston is that the former mayor, Steve Haggerty, put together a COVID-19 task force. And he invited sectors of the community, probably about 40 in all, to gather together for weekly calls on Friday afternoon to update each other on what was going on and for the city to share as best they could how they were handling COVID-19. And that was very helpful, because what the coordinators of each of the sectors were able to do is to take the information from the mayor, who received information from the governor and the governor's office, right back to our constituents and congregations. So we were able to share with them and update every single week exactly where we were and how we were progressing with COVID-19. So additional stress factors, of course, that continued during this time were related to physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress, spiritual stress. And added to that, of course, were pre-existing crises that existed before the pandemic even began. So we had to handle, for those of us who are on the front line, people who are struggling with relationships, people who are struggling with illnesses and sometimes terminal illnesses, talking with their families and encouraging them, and then doing all of that in the midst of the pandemic. We were confronted with a lot of different things, of course, and one of them was that we were not allowed to gather together. For people who got sick, we couldn't go to the hospital and visit them. Family members were not allowed to visit them in the hospital. For those who were in convalescent homes and care centers, They were not allowed visitors either, because at that time, people were just unsure about COVID-19 and how it might be contagious. And so during that time, we were able to create new vehicles for helping people to deal with grief and stress. What we did at our church and other houses of worship, synagogues, mosques, and churches, they created care network systems where leaders of the congregations were able to phone every member of the congregation and to give them an update on where we were as a church, to encourage them, and to also find out how the church might be supportive. One of the things that we did is we also created an opportunity to work with other organizations in the community with feeding programs. One of them was a C&W feeding program that is still going on right now. So it was wonderful. And finally, I think that we were able to do robocalls and email blasts in order to reach people. And I just want to end this by saying that for me, as I struggled with it, I asked members of the church to write me a letter. And when it was all said and done, these many months later, I received 658 letters from members of the congregation. And I promise you, I wrote every single member back, keeping in touch. So those were different ways that we were able to deal with it. I'm happy to be with you this morning with this opening comment, and I wish you all well for an outstanding panel discussion that is to follow. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Pastor Neighbors. And Pastor Neighbors is going right to his service, which started at 9:30. So we appreciated even more that he was here on a Sunday morning. So now it's my pleasure to turn it to Dr. Michelle Nealon, who's the president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and she will welcome you as well. Dr. Nealon?
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's my pleasure to welcome you all as well. I'm amazed to see so many people with us today. When we decided to host this wonderful conference virtually this year, I had no idea that we would be able to welcome so many people. Despite COVID-19, NRCI has continued to make a huge impact this year. NRCI was selected by the Women's Club of Evanston to be the recipient of funds at their yearly gala, and $40,000 was raised last September at the virtual gala that will fund a Teen Leadership Academy to educate teens on mental health so as that they can be advocates for themselves, their families, and their friends. NRCI also continued to educate college students with the mental health first aid training, which moved to a virtual format. And finally, NRCI offered very relevant workshops, including Mental Health Wellness 101, Cultivating Emotional Wellness Amidst COVID-19, Preventing Sexual Harassment, QPR, and Addressing Ethical Issues, a case study approach. We are just thrilled to continue our partnership with NRCI, increasing the access to mental health services and resources while reducing the stigma. Enjoy the conference, everyone, and I'll turn it back now to you, Dr. Martin.
Thank you so much, President Nealon, for being here today to welcome everyone. So now I just have a couple quick tips, and then we're gonna get started with the panel. We're putting the social media into the chat. So if you like to tweet, share on Instagram, your thoughts about the conference, that would be great. We have Facebook as well, and also Twitter. So I'll put those in the chat. But now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Koset. He is our moderator, and so he is a professor and a department chair of the Counselor Education and Supervision Department on the Chicago campus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He earned his PhD in counselor education from the University of Arkansas. He is a licensed mental health provider, and he is going to introduce all the panelists for you and take it away. So thank you so much, Dr. Koset.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, and welcome to all the participants. It's great to see where people are coming from all over the world. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Serena Wadwa. She is a psychotherapist and professor at Governor State University, and her area of expertise is on stress management. And so she'll be lending a special perspective about the importance of recognizing the overlap between stress and grief. And she's a yoga instructor, blogger, and an author. Our next panelist, next slide, please, is Dr. Jillian Bluford. She is a faculty member and professor at the University of Denver and is chairing the Grief Competency Task Force for the American Counseling Association. And I get to the honor of serving with Dr. Bluford on that task force. And her clinical areas are working with hospice and bereavement centers, psychiatric behavioral hospital settings, and she is an independent counselor for the Tennessee Department of Children and Family Services. Next slide, please. And we have Mr. David Fireman. He's the executive director of the Center for Grief Recovery and Therapeutic Services right here in Rogers Park, Illinois, near Evanston. And he holds a psychotherapy practice which focuses on in-depth psychologies and the self. And he also focuses on social learning and the interconnection between love and loss. I'd like to welcome him. And the next slide, please. And then we have the unique opportunity to hear from Michael Catania. He has extensive work in the Illinois Board of Higher Education. And during COVID, he himself was impacted by COVID, and he's going to share a little bit about sharing the relationship that he forged with his medical providers and now kind of helping educate other people about COVID and using social media to help others who are dealing with the virus. All right, next slide, please. So we presented a series of questions to our panelists. And so after each panelist has an opportunity to share their perspective, after the break, we'll try to address some of these questions. And again, please feel free throughout this time to ask questions or make comments. You can address specific panelists in the chat box, and our team will be fielding those questions. So some of the questions that we're going to be dealing with is, how does grief and stress, how has it impacted individuals, families, and the culture as a whole because of the COVID pandemic? And then what are the unique types of grief and loss that we have faced because of the global pandemic? And then the next question is, what are the long-term impacts of grief and loss on children, adolescents, and adults and older adults as a result of the global pandemic? You know, I hear a lot of talk, especially over the past few weeks, as people are returning to school and work and things like that, kind of going back to normal. But I would argue that, you know, it's going to be a very new normal, whatever that looks like. The next one is, what can counselors, therapists, and helping professionals do to serve our communities when dealing with grief and stress? And I think we've just hit the tip of the iceberg regarding grief and loss as a result of the pandemic. And then what resources do our panelists believe can help people address the unique grief and stress because of COVID-19? So we'll go to the next slide. So I want to share a little bit. So I am a professor, as Dr. Martin mentioned, and okay, we go back to the slides, please. And so I'm a professor in teaching mental health counseling, and I have taught a grief counseling course for the past 20 years. And one of the things that I have shared with my students is that grief is unique. We all share the experience of grief, though, but in different ways. And so I liken grief to snowflakes. Just as there are no two snowflakes that are alike, people do not grieve the same way. And so it's important, especially during the COVID pandemic, to recognize that grief is complex, and that whether it's our family members, close friends, our colleagues, everyone deals with grief and loss in very different terms. And so it's also important to remember that for individuals who were experiencing grief and loss prior to COVID, that the pandemic exacerbated those grief symptoms. So whether we're talking about anxiety, stress, depression, that those symptoms may have escalated in addition to the traditional grief that they may have been experiencing. And everyone has been experiencing some form of grief and loss and stress because of COVID. Certainly some more directly through maybe losing a family member because of COVID, or just being socially isolated from family members, friends, from colleagues. Next slide, please. So I want to present to you some myths that may exist about grief and loss, and think about if some of these myths are ones that maybe were messages that you were sent in your family of origin or in your community, or maybe we still carry them today. So then the first myth is that all losses are the same. And in my therapeutic practice with clients, This is something that I see often where there is kind of a grief comparison. Well, my loss is greater than somebody else's, or conversely, well, my loss is nothing compared to somebody else's. And so, especially those of us who are therapists or mental health providers, it's really important to work with our clients to normalize that all loss is valid and that we need to normalize and affirm a variety of losses that people are experiencing. I know in my clinical work with clients, sometimes people may feel, well, I just had a pet loss. That's nothing in comparison to a partner loss or a loss of a child. And certainly it is important to recognize that different losses impact us differently. But we want to validate all clients' experiences in terms of recognizing the impact that their loss has had in their life. The next myth is that grief always declines over time. We'll hear the notion of time heals all wounds, but sometimes grief can come up decades later. And if grief isn't dealt with in the present moment, and people will push it down or bury it, oftentimes it may come up years or again, even decades later. So it's important for people to understand that when they may think that they have successfully worked through a loss, that things can come back again through other more present losses. The next myth is that it's better to put painful things out of your mind. And I know, having taught a grief class for 20 years, I've had students who say, oh no, I'm not taking that class, it's too much. And I'll say, well, that's exactly why you need to take this class, because in order to help other people, clients and stakeholders working with their grief and loss, we have to be able to have walked our own journey, at least begun the process of examining our own grief and pain in our own lives. So it is important to be vulnerable and to talk about our losses with people that we trust in a safe environment. And the last myth I want to talk about is that sometimes people feel like, well, if I express my feelings, if I tap into those emotions, I'm going to lose control. And while certainly grief and the emotions around grief can be overwhelming, that's why reaching out for mental health services is crucial to help all of us sort out those various feelings that we're going through, including grief and loss around COVID. So we'll go to the next slide. So Zai and Do, one of the benefits of, with technology and research is that even though COVID has been around only about a year and a half, researchers have already begun publishing in this area. So if you are looking for clinical information to help you, Zai and Do, it's a brief article, but it's really important. And they talk about two types of losses that we've experienced as a result of COVID-19. The first one is a primary loss. And obviously that examples include losing a loved one because of COVID, maybe ourselves having COVID as well, and the major life changes that are impacted by that. And then Zhao and Du talk about the secondary losses, and that can be not being able to connect socially in person with loved ones or friends, not being able to go to work in person, maybe businesses shut down, things like that. And they coined a term in their article, which I think was really helpful, especially for those of us who are frontline workers as mental health professionals or medical professionals, and they called that bereavement overload. And as we know, with any clinicians, any mental health professionals constantly dealing with any kind of crisis and trauma, including grief and loss, we have to have the importance of self-care and taking care of ourselves as we're then in turn helping people through their own grief and loss. So for those of us who are working with clients, and I would say all clinicians right now are kind of specializing in grief counseling, grief and loss because of the pandemic, we have to take care of ourselves in order to prevent bereavement overload. And that the idea of bereavement overload is where we're just constantly bombarded with loss after loss, of dealing with client loss and then our own as well. Next slide, please. So I have some images on the screen, and what I'd ask you to do is in the chat box, if you would identify based on the images that you see, what types of grief and loss do you see on the screen kind of depicted? So if you would just put a couple examples in the chat box, and then we'll just have a little bit of an ability to interact with each other. So what types of grief and losses do you see in the images on the screen? Okay, family separation, right? Relationships, mobility, right? Loss of intimacy, companionship, betrayal, loss of home, safety, death. Yes. And so we see examples of fire, we see a burglary, the loss of sense of security and safety. We see possibly a sexual trauma, harassment at the top that can bring out forms of loss of financial security. We look in the upper right-hand corner, we see older adults in some type of facility, a sense of independence. In the upper left-hand corner, we see photographs, images of the Flint water crisis. So environmental racism, we see medical health issues impacted by the Flint water crisis as an example of grief and loss, job loss, certainly death, divorce. But you also may question, well, why do you have a picture of a married couple on their wedding day there? What does that have to do with grief and loss? Even positive events can bring out a form of grief and loss. So for example, with individuals who are getting married, their sense of individuation, their sense of singlehood, maybe now they're have to let their partner know, well, where are you going? And maybe even giving up of one's legal name and taking on a partner's name can give a sense of loss. Or if that same couple, say after 6 months or a year of just being together, they now have children, and now the sense of our identity as a couple, where we can go to vacation or we can just hop in the car and do whatever we want as a couple, well, that is no longer the case because now we have a child we have to take care of. Even in the case of, for example, as professors, we love to see students graduate at their commencement. Well, many institutions, whether it was middle school, high school, college, or graduate school, professional school, the loss of a commencement. So imagine you work years completing a graduate degree and you can't participate in a commencement. However, we were able to this past year, and we will do it again at our school, having virtual commencements. And so it's an opportunity to take something that may be a negative and turning it into a positive. So next slide, please. So it's important to remember, Bertuccio and Runyon talked about that for family members and friends who have had a loved one die of COVID, there could be a sense of anticipatory grief, but that is also stilted. We hear examples of where family members were not able to be with each other when their loved ones were passing from COVID. And I think many of us maybe have seen images in the social media or on TV of where a nurse or a medical practitioner had to literally put a phone or an iPad so that family members could see and talk to their loved one before they passed. Just heart-wrenching images because they were not able to have, yes, that loss of human touch, especially in the last moments of death. And so for medical personnel who were the only ones with family members, they were the conduit. They were the ones who could put a hand on their shoulder to be with them physically present because their family members weren't able to be there. So an inability to be physically and emotionally close to loved ones as they were dying. And then the prolonged grief disorder can really apply here, the inability to grieve and express traditional rituals and customs. So we heard the pastors talk of this morning about being disconnected from his congregation and thinking about how many family members were not able to practice traditional forms of mourning and bereavement because of COVID. So not only are we grieving the loss of our loved one, but we're also grieving the fact that we can't gather in our churches, our synagogues, our mosques because of COVID. And then finally, survivor's guilt. COVID was very strange in the fact that you could have a couple or members of a family all in the same house where one got very sick because of COVID and maybe even passed, and yet others in the same household did not get COVID. So there could be guilt of, well, why didn't COVID take me? Why did it take my loved one? Next slide. So there's different types of losses that we have experienced because of COVID. So certainly loss of life, which is very significant. So that's where someone has died due to COVID. The sense of freedom, we can't just go and I know for me personally, when we were told to leave our offices at school and come home, and I thought, well, it'll be an extended snow day for a week or two. And I don't think anybody envisioned that we would be doing this over a year and a half, close to 2 years later. So the feeling of loss of safety, again, not being able to connect with family members, friends. We are generally a communal people. We're needing to connect with one another. Also, again, loss of rituals. So, people had to delay weddings, funerals, graduations, proms. Very much feel for high school students the past few years who were not able to have social markers like the prom or other things. But I will say, on a strength-based perspective, people were able to be very creative. So you had drive-by graduations where graduates were able to stand in their cap and gown on their yard when neighbors, honked by, or birthday parties or things like that. So again, it's our need to connect that drove this creativity. Loss of jobs and businesses. We're still seeing that. I live here in Chicago, and you'll drive by a favorite restaurant or a store and you'll see that the doors are shuttered permanently. And it's a little form of grief and loss, like, oh, that was my favorite pizza or my favorite burger or whatever. And so now, that business is closed forever. Back in my hometown of Cleveland, a restaurant, it was a European restaurant. It was open for 97 years and they had to close because of COVID. And it just broke my heart that it was an institution in my hometown and closed forever. Loss of hobbies and recreation. So if someone uses sports as a way to just cope in the daily stresses of life, but they couldn't be able to do that because of COVID, those can be challenges. And ambiguous loss. One of the things about grief and loss is that sometimes clients will come to therapy and they'll know that they're struggling, they're depressed, anxious, but they don't know why. But if we help them unpack it, it's because it's grief and loss, but because it's not a death, people often don't recognize it as a form of grief because someone hasn't died, but that we're still grieving. Next slide. And so the Bertuccio and Runyon talk about uncertainty distress. And I believe David's going to talk a little bit about that later in his presentation. The idea of that there's so much unknownness during COVID-19. When are we going back to work? Are children going to be able to go back to school? When can we hug our relatives? So all of that uncertainty can cause extreme amount of stress and grief and loss, not knowing when things are going to go back to quote unquote normal. And certainly complicated grief. And those of us who do grief work with individual clients and groups, we talk about complicated grief where someone may be stuck in their grief and ruminating because they're not able to express their grief in healthy ways. Next slide, please. And so Zawin to talk about how do we help clients adapt to loss in a positive way. So it's, again, being creative. A lot of families were having virtual family reunions through Zoom. I'm sure Zoom made a lot of money during this pandemic. Places of worship were having virtual services. Again, because of our need to maintain ritual, maintain that sense of community and connection. So reconstructing meaning as much as possible. So even in our field, in the mental health services, clients shifted to online therapy. And so for some clients, it was very beneficial because they could be in the safety of their home and yet still get good quality mental health services. And I talked to many therapists who prior to COVID would say, I would never do online therapy with clients. And pretty much every therapist has resolved to now do online therapy. And I think it is here to stay. And so whether we're psychology, counseling, social work, or other discipline, we're all going to have to grapple with the new normal of how online therapy is going to stay with us, not moving forward. Next slide. And so again, these are images for how do children adapt. For younger children, they don't know anything except wearing a mask. And so being socially distant, connecting, not being able to connect with their teachers. And so how has grief and loss? And so our panelists are going to address that momentarily. Next slide. So again, we have unemployment or underemployment. We have kids who've been displaced, kids who have lacked social interaction because of COVID, kids who were not able to have graduation ceremonies, businesses that have closed. So these are just some examples of how grief has specifically impacted us during COVID. Next slide. And I'm going to turn over to Dr. Serena Wadwa for her to talk about stress and COVID-19.
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to just give an overview of stress because obviously when there's a lot of loss that's happening, it can be very threatening. It can really shift a lot of things that happen for you. And so just kind of, very briefly, talking about acute versus chronic stress. So usually what happens is that day-to-day experiences, you might have like inconveniences that, happen really quickly. You can't find your car keys. You can't, I don't know, find your checkbook, whatever it may be. And so once you actually find that particular item, excuse me, the response diminishes, right? So you go back into this kind of baseline, we'll just call that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the general adaptation response in a moment. So acute is really just short term. It just kind of happens in the moment. And a lot of people experience, well, pretty much everybody experiences this. Let me just say it that way. And then of course the chronic one is when one of the most important things that I've seen in my experience professionally is that most people do not have or get or do the opportunity to recover from an instantaneous kind of stressor. And so, for example, I'm just going to use the example of losing your car keys. So you lose your car key, or you don't know where your car keys are at, and that's going to initiate the stress response, right? So some of you may have experienced this, where you get a little frantic, you get a little hypervigilant, you get a little stressed, overwhelmed. And then once you actually find the car keys, things kind of go back to normal, whatever that may look like for you. And then you go about your day. What happens is that a lot of people do not get that kind of recovery period, which is actually part of the general adaptation response. And this recovery period really just kind of allows your body to get back to your baseline, whatever that may be. And the example I usually use with clients is, talking about how like a baseline blood pressure, for example, might be 120 over, I think it's 80, I believe, or 40. I can't remember which one exactly, sorry. But so you have this baseline blood pressure. And so every time that the fight-flight response is initiated, blood pressure goes up a little bit because that's part of the stress response. And so what happens is that once that initial threat is what's perceived in the brain, diminishes, it goes down, things feel a little bit safer, then the baseline recovery can happen, blood pressure goes down, et cetera, et cetera. And so with acute stressors, with acute stress in general, the flight-fight response, you have this opportunity most of the time to do that. With chronic stress, what tends to happen, and this is like long-term, chronic stress is very long-term. And, grief and loss definitely play a part in that because, lots of things change and that could be very threatening for people, and not necessarily like, when I say threatening, I mean like it can feel unsafe, it can feel uncertain, it could feel, all kinds of different things. Those are the two main ones that most people may experience and do actually. So with chronic stress, what tends to happen is that there is not that baseline recovery, so to speak. And so it's like a stressor upon a stressor upon a stressor. And with grief and loss in particular, especially during the pandemic, there have been lots of losses for people, lots of different ways that this has happened. And so it's hard to be able to get to a recovery period, excuse me, and also even to just process through one initial loss. And so then there's this kind of stressor that's built upon the previous stressor, which has not even had an opportunity to go through recovery. So with chronic stress, it differs for people. It could be usually about 6 months. Sometimes it could be less, sometimes it could be more. It really just kind of depends on the person and the circumstances and all that kind of stuff. But once that occurs, when people get more into a chronic stress stage, there is a lot more symptoms that result from that. Fatigue is really big. And so some of you, you may think about how, especially with the pandemic, adding on a bunch of new responsibilities, demands, roles, whatever that may be, those are stressors. And so as you do not have an opportunity to kind of go back to your whatever it is that you did to relax or to just kind of break away from everything that was going on when you felt overwhelmed, what tends to happen then is that there is not, that recovery period just does not exist. And so it's built, on top of each other and over and over and over again. And so going into the general adaptation response, we're looking at the fact that, kind of like a normal reaction response, and I say that in air quotes and in quotes that you will see on my screen, is that, you have this initial flight fight response. Sometimes it is going to be a freeze response. And then of course there is this period of time where, once the threat is dealt with, and that could be safety is occurring, the inconvenience is solved, whatever it may look like, the body is able to go back into its normal state. So when that does not occur though, because a lot of times, as I mentioned before, there's a stressor, there's another thing that happens. So the example I like to give people is basically, let's say you can't find your car keys in the morning sometime. So you're already kind of flight fight happening. And so you find your car keys, you go in the car, you're getting ready to go to work or wherever it is that you're going. And then you realize that you don't have certain papers with you or certain documents that you may need. And so here now, instead of the body being able to go back to its baseline, there's a perception of, oh my goodness, I need this stuff, whatever it may be. And so another stressor occurs. So the body goes back into this fight flight response. And it continues that. Now, what's unique, what I find very interesting, and a lot of clients have seen this too, is that with the general adaptation response, there comes a point, which is part of the chronic stress, where the body starts to become a little bit more resistant, not resistant, but it kind of just like adapts to it, so to speak. It says, okay, I see that you have a lot more going on. There's a lot of things happening, and I'm going to just help you with this. And so this is like the second wind that a lot of people describe, right? You get like this burst of energy, you're motivated, you're going about your weeks, whatever it may be. And so most people don't recognize that this is the way the body works in some respects. And so the body says, okay, you know what? I'm going to give you this stuff, and hopefully, and remembering that you are also going to take care of me when this is all done. So the last part of the general adaptation response is the exhaustion stage. And the body really just kind of at this point says it can't do anymore. It doesn't have any more to offer. Energy is zapped. The chemicals that are usually released in the flight fight response are diminished because the adrenal glands and the other parts of the body, the way the body works, cannot produce what is needed in the moment because they've been exhausted, they've been depleted. So with the general adaptation response, once a person gets into exhaustion stage, which is also the chronic stage, this is when the body basically just says, okay, I can see that you're not really taking care of me, so I'm going to do something in order to initiate that. People may get sick, people may have some sort of spiritual awakening, which is a Brene Brown term, and I really like that, instead of a breakdown. Or they may, sleep like for hours and hours, more so on the weekend than they usually do. However, a person's individual body works. The chemicals that are released are, chemicals, and a lot of people have known about this. However, not noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol are the three main chemicals that exist. And in small amounts, these chemicals are really, really important for, body functioning. They work with blood pressure. They work with other types of natural, organic kind of things that are happening that you don't pay attention to. Yet when a person is going through a lot of stress, these chemicals are released in heightened means. So there's going to be more cortisol, more adrenaline, more noradrenaline, and that in actuality, after a period of time, can cause damage to the body. And that's known, and some of you have heard this before, like stress-induced hypertension, stress-induced, skin disorders, stress-induced insomnia. Those are all kinds of different things that can happen as a result of that. So that's a very basic overview of stress and kind of what it looks like. And really just keeping in mind that losing things can be very threatening. Because there's lots of things that happen as a result of that. And Michael, went over a lot of those different pieces of it. So the idea with that is that, there's a loss of certainty as well. The mind and the brain and the body do not have that anymore. The heart doesn't have that anymore. And so it increases the physical response because every day is going to be a little bit different. So physically going into increased stressors, we're looking at how does the stress response occur for this person. I'm sorry, I'm going to just take a sip of water here for the person in order to just kind of know that, there's a lot more demand being put on the body. There's a lot more responsibility being put on the body. And I relate that a lot to kind of like if you look at a wet paper towel, for example, if you have a certain amount of grapes on it, for example, it can still stay sturdy. But if you keep adding stuff, adding more grapes and adding more grapes and adding more grapes, at some point the paper towel is going to break. And so this is what the stress response does, is that it's a way for the body to kind of adapt to what's happening. And at the same time, when there's lots of losses that are occurring simultaneously, which is what's been happening during the pandemic, the stress response can, it can really just keep it at a resistant stage, which is the second stage, or a exhaustion stage, which is the last stage before the body just kind of collapses. And some of you may have experienced that as well. When you experience this, it's just one of those things that with the body, it just is a stressor in and of itself. It needs its rest. So looking also at mental stressors as well. This is another thing that has happened during the pandemic. A lot of times people now are having to think about things that they may not have to think about before. For example, helping a child who's in school with their mathematics. I don't know about you. Last time I used mathematics skills was a while ago, except for when I go to the grocery store or look at my bank account. But like the kinds of things that people are learning, students that are learning in school is not very much similar to what we're doing now. And so mentally, there's also this increased demand of energy and just thinking about things and whatever. So now you have, on top of what's happening with the body, you're having now mental exhaustion as well. You're looking at, okay, now I've got to work on or help with schoolwork or working from home, which can also have a different impact on people, and also change cognitive functioning. A lot of times what I've seen at least is that people may procrastinate a little bit more. The loss of structure is really important. People want to have some freedom with what they can do, and at the same time, structure also helps to center them. So that's one of those kind of paradoxes that exist. So really looking at how, this kind of lack of structure works for people, because a lot of times when people are working from home, it's not the same as transitioning to an office space. It's not the same as commuting. It's not the same as, any of those things that relate to when you go to another physical place. And then stressors again. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. There you go. Stressors again, you have emotional stressors. So again, as I mentioned before, loss and grief, losses in general, have a lot of uncertainty that exists with them, particularly if it's with a person. There, some people have put in the chat box there, just kind of the loss of that connection, the loss of that stability, the loss of that dependability, reliability, whatever that may look like. And so even, during the pandemic, emotionally, people were a lot more isolated if they weren't with somebody. Singlehood, somebody mentioned that as well, can be very stressful. And so it increases the stress response on the body as well. A lot of people have felt disconnected due to the pandemic, which is also a stressor. And then, coming out of the pandemic, even emotionally speaking, re-emerging anxiety is something that's going to be, important to look at. Because, at least with people that I've talked with, both in my professional and personal life, it's like, wow, over a year, we have not been able to socialize, go out and socialize with strangers, other people. And now going out, things are opening up. It can cause a lot of anxiety because people don't know what to expect. And of course, then on the spectrum of, the vaccine itself, some people feel safe enough to do it, some people don't. So I think that's also the other piece of the increased stressors, is that sense of safety. So when people don't feel safe, which I've heard from quite a few people, actually, they're not sure if another person has gotten vaccinated. They may go to the grocery store, masks are not required if you're vaccinated, but is there really a way to confirm or get some certainty about the fact that somebody is or is not? So that also poses as a stressor for people. So with the pandemic, those are all different things that have occurred. And, with loss and grief too, I think it's important to recognize too that a lot of people, especially if they lost their job or where they lived, identity is tied to some of that. And so they may have lost part of their identity, not really knowing who they are. So that increases some stress as well. And really looking at, the certainty, I think, is also important. Just having kind of like the security and safety of what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, that routine. And then, of course, the pandemic took that away for a lot of people. And so kind of struggling with how do you go back to what it was? And re-emerging anxiety, as I mentioned before, kind of focuses more on the social connections. How do you socialize with people? A lot of times people have kind of reevaluated their life and prioritized differently due to the pandemic, because they had that year and a half time frame to do that. But then kind of going back out into the world that they were in can also be very anxiety producing and stressful. Excuse me. So really looking at some of those different stressors that exist. So some strategies that can help with that. One of them is the basics, excuse me. And the way that this is kind of broken down is like, the first B stands for basics, not the first B, but the B stands for breakfast, excuse me, for breakfast or breaks. And, really that's aligned with making sure that people are getting the right nutrition. Eating tends to also be different, and a lot of people have experienced either overeating. I'm sure some of you have heard about the COVID-15. People have gained weight. Some people have lost weight, and they may, that may be a result of just the stress that they've experienced too. But just making sure that people are having, healthy nutrition. The A stands for attitude, so this relates to different thoughts. Kind of looking at what people are thinking about reemerging back into society, what their thoughts are about being, isolated or whatever the case may be. I know a few people have expressed to me about how there is some anxiety about just even going out, outside the confines of their home, because they don't know what other people are doing. They don't know how other people are handling the pandemic. And so, that is also important to look at. The S stands for steps. And so this is more related to movement. And these are basics, just doing some sort of physical movement. I don't particularly like the word exercise, but, and I find that movement kind of can be a little bit more all-inclusive. So, it could be just like parking your car further away from the grocery store entrance so that you have to walk a little bit farther. Whatever that may look like. The I stands for inventory. So this is really looking at just kind of day-to-day experiences, what's kind of coming up for you, which relates to the second point there for strategies. But going back to the first one, we have C, which is again, more looking at not just attitude is a little bit different than thoughts. So attitude can reflect more of kind of like how people feel externally. Thoughts are a little bit more internally. So really looking kind of at specific thoughts, specific patterns that are existing for a person and how that may be a result of the pandemic and affecting their experience. I know, for example, that some people that I've worked with have shifted thoughts. And so there is some loss with that, because when thoughts change into more anxiety producing thoughts, that's a loss of some certainty that the person had. It's not uncommon for people to have developed some depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, things of that nature as a result of it. So really looking kind of at what are specific thoughts that people have. And then the S there stands for sleep. And so really looking at sleep, people's sleep patterns may have been off because they're working more, they have to stay up more because of homeschooling, working from home, having to take care of a home, whatever that may be, a combination of all of them. So the second one that's listed there is strategies, and these are logs and patterns, which kind of relates to what I had mentioned earlier about the inventory. But, really being able to kind of track certain things to see what you want to work on or what somebody wants to work on can be helpful. And then the last one is self-compassion. And I really think this is a big one. The pandemic has produced a lot of grief and loss for people, and it's been very overwhelming. And sometimes people may think that they are supposed to handle everything. They're supposed to be able to take whatever is coming to them. And that may not be the case. It may very well be that, looking at how can I be kinder to myself, basically, okay? And then regulation, this is just kind of looking at, what helps you stay kind of at baseline. It could be anything. It could be the basics, which again stands for breaks or breakfast, attitude, steps, inventory, cognitive, and sleep. But really just kind of recognizing how, we're experiencing something and have experienced something that hasn't happened for a lot of people. And so some of it may be traumatizing for people, and recognizing that that's a normal reaction. It is a stress-induced reaction, and really looking at how is the brain taking this on and the mind taking this on, and going from there. Regulation, of course, I meant in terms of emotions, how do people regulate themselves? Really just kind of looking at getting some sort of support around that, and skills, which are the other two listed there. But really being able to help regulate some of the anxiety that has increased for a lot of people, the depression that's increased. It's not uncommon, just feeling overwhelmed in general. Support is important. I know, for example, a lot of people felt disconnected during the pandemic. And so really just kind of rekindling some connection, finding people that you could talk to, even if it's virtually, but just being able to connect with other people can be very helpful. And then of course, the last one is skills, because these are just not usual times that we're experiencing, there may be some skills that people don't have, they never had to have them, or it was not necessary. So the idea of it then is really looking at, okay, what kind of skills may I need in order to help me recover or heal from some of the stress, the sense of being overwhelmed from the pandemic. And that's something that, through therapy or just, talking to a support group or whatever that may look like can help with. So that's what I have at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Serena. And now we're going to have Dr. Jillian Bluford share her thoughts.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about how grief is so culturally contextual and so dynamic. And I encourage you all to think about, everyone here, I imagine, has experienced some type of loss related to COVID or not. And I encourage you all to think about, when you first experience one of your earliest losses, what did the adults around you, how did they express their grief? How did they mourn? How did they talk about their grief, or maybe didn't? Because that is how we really learn about grief, about expression of grief. How do we talk about our losses? It's from our early memories and our early interactions with the adults who are also grieving those similar losses and from those communities. And so from the very beginning, our culture is informing how we grieve, and systemic factors, they continue to reinforce, right? How do we grieve? How do we respond? When is it too much of an expression? Who is allowed to respond and to express their way in an authentic manner, right? There's no textbook or manual to grieve. And so a lot of it is just influenced by our culture, our religious, spiritual beliefs and backgrounds, our family roles, right? And our identities and how those change over time, community norms, again, especially if the loss was felt within the community, just our age, right? And developmental capacities and spaces and how that evolves over time, our values, again, our beliefs, our norms. A lot of that is contextual to our upbringing, right? And then we go out into the world and we interact with other people and we share our grief experiences and expressions and responses to others, and that cycle continues. Loss, as Michael mentioned before, is ambiguous and disproportionate, right? So while there's not every loss is equal, there has been, especially with COVID, a lot of communities that have experienced loss more than others, right? And the disproportionate ratios in their losses has become apparent to other communities and to the world, right? And so just again, when we have all those losses, and if it's not a death loss that has a little more of a finite experience, we tend to feel really ambiguous, right? And is this a loss? Can I question this? Can I grieve this? Can I share my loss with other people? Or, and what happens, such as COVID, when our losses continue and continue, right? And we had no idea that we would still be in this position, in this situation. But here we are, right? Continually to experience losses and continuous grief throughout this whole pandemic and for the future, quite honestly. Also society and different communities, different countries, cultural norms, we create norms about what counts as a loss, right? And who can grieve, right? And so while I'm sure, everyone here listening and part of this panel and attending today understands that, loss is valid and all losses have their validity, and we don't need to question anyone's loss. In the greater communities, sometimes we do, right? We put limitations on what a loss can be and who can grieve, and especially thinking about, at least in America, we have like very short bereavement leave policies. And so we dictate, right? How long can you really grieve, and when do you need to get back to what we think normal is for you? And for a lot of communities, that puts us in a tough predicament. And so, the term disenfranchised grief and grievers, coined by Kenneth Doka, really kind of highlights that we, not everyone is given the same space to grieve. And oftentimes that can be because of their age, right? Oftentimes we don't look at children and adolescents as having the capacity to understand the loss. So therefore, their grief isn't as valid, right? Or depending on the circumstances surrounding the loss, right? We have some stigma, right, and taboo towards it. And working with clients now who have lost individuals related to COVID, or even those who have lost loved ones this year unrelated to COVID, they're like, can I still express my grief in that way? Because I lost one maybe due to natural causes or due to an accident. But everyone is so focused on the pandemic and the amount of deaths that we have had since the beginning of the pandemic, right? Other people have had losses that, again, have been unrelated to COVID. And so how can I, is my loss still valid, right? How do I compare to other people? And again, so it's happening all the time. It's culturally dynamic, and there are tons of communities that have been impacted by losses and their inability to really grieve in a way that's going to be helpful for them. Next slide, please. Right, so then, aside from COVID, grief is cultural, grief is dynamic, loss is ambiguous and can be disproportionate, and then you add COVID, right? That is just loss after loss after loss and continues to this day. And that has just, again, highlighted the disparities between various communities and racial and ethnic disparities between number of cases of COVID, between number of deaths, and even the vaccination rates as we're seeing now. And so it's just reinforcing that the barriers are already there, the disconnect between a lot of communities of color, a lot of rural communities, and the healthcare systems that have always been there prior to COVID. We have seen that, oh, this really is an issue, right? And the lack of an access to care has really been reinforced and heightened and brought to a lot of people's attention because of the swiftness of this pandemic and just how it has spread all over the globe. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to add in a couple of just graphs that I have found that, again, we read and we see that, yeah, there are some disparities between communities of color, between rural communities, indigenous communities. And when you look at the numbers, it makes things a lot more clear, right? And so this is just the COVID-19 hospitalization and death rates kind of categorized by race and ethnicity. And this was just last July, right? And so who knows what has happened since then? But you see the disparities, right? And again, while grief and loss is universal, it doesn't mean that communities aren't hit harder than others. Next slide, please. And then on the flip side, so the first graph cover hospitalizations, and this one is covering vaccinations. And so while communities of color have been hit harder with COVID cases, hospitalizations, death rates, they are not in the top, right, racial identity groups to receive vaccinations, right? And I'm kind of going to get into that a little bit later of, again, the disparities, the barriers, the lack of trust, the hesitancy for receiving the vaccinations. But again, it's another can be seen as another loss, right? A lot of people see vaccinations as the way to get back to the way that things were, and how can all these things that I've lost over the past, 14, 15 months, this is my ticket and my tool, right, to get back to those things. But if it's not being offered, if it's not being accessible by everyone, then not everyone is going to be able to get back to where they think they want to be, right? Or where they were before, if that's even where they want to go anymore. And so then additional losses will keep accruing for those hardest hit communities. Next slide, please. So some additional, again, cultural impacts, as it was mentioned before, a lot of communities really value just in-person communication, in-person visits, and spending time with their support systems. And that just wasn't the case. Although a lot of people adapted quickly to FaceTime and to Zoom and to using other ways to still connect with their families. If there wasn't accessibility to adequate internet or technology, then they weren't able to see their families, right? And kind of had to resort to other things. And or if families live close by, maybe we're able to drop off food or just say hello from outside, then that was a possibility. But for a lot of people who maybe live distance and weren't able to travel, then that community, that aspect of just having that support system wasn't there, right? I've had a lot of clients that have given birth over the past year and really depended on, was hoping for that family support, that community support, and they weren't able to receive it because individuals, they just didn't feel comfortable with people coming into their homes or them going to visit other people. In addition to just the disparities that we've seen with COVID cases itself, you know, a lot of communities of color, a lot of rural communities, women in particular were hit with loss of employment and therefore loss of health insurance, loss of financial security, right? People weren't planning for this pandemic. And so if they were already struggling to get by and didn't have, you know, adequate savings or plan B or plan C, then this was a really tough, it has been a really tough 14, 15 months for a lot of communities. And now, again, as a lot of places in the world are getting back to quote unquote normal, that means that some of these benefits, unemployment benefits and things like that are starting to go away, right? And again, we want to desperately be back to where we were before, but that wasn't working for a lot of people. And a lot of people aren't there yet and they're not ready yet. But a lot of these resources may be going away soon. And that also hits on accessibility. A lot of individuals who maybe were able to keep their job and maybe start to work from home or remote or other options that really, it works well for them. It worked well for their family. It, you know, it was just a smoother transition for them. Or now, you know, a lot of employers are saying, hey, do we need to come back to the office? What does this look like? We need to, you know, we need everyone back. And for some that wasn't feasible for them before, but they did it because they had to, are now trying to decide what's my next step, right? And how do I advocate for myself to keep this accessibility that I was able to gain over the past year when, again, we want to shift back to a lot of in-person, coming to the office, transportation, all those things again. Next slide, please. And so finally, I just want to talk on and touch on rituals. I know that was talked about before, but rituals can provide such comfort, community. It can recognize the loss, especially if it is a death-related loss. It can provide structure during a time of just chaos and uncertainty, scariness. And so the fact that many people haven't been able to engage, particularly in death-related rituals, but rituals of all types this past year has really put, you know, an additional strain, right, and barriers to the grieving process. A lot of times we see rituals as a way to, an allowance to grieve, right, and to be around those who are grieving as well. But with isolation and social distancing and not being able to maybe, you know, be in close contact with other people, or you're watching a service through Zoom, right? It just puts the additional complications in one's grieving process. And so when I think about, you know, moving forward, and again, moving forward in a way that is sustainable, that is accessible, that is inclusive of all cultures, I think about, you know, the medical community and how a lot of communities, again, even prior to COVID, had some distrust in the medical community, but are now either being required, strongly encouraged to receive vaccinations, to prove vaccinations, are, you know, struggling quite a bit, right? And again, there can be a hesitation to vaccinations. There can be a hesitation to even just being around large groups of people again, right? I have a lot of clients that they say, yeah, sure, I'll receive the vaccination, and I don't know if I'll ever want to be in a large space again. I don't know if I'll ever want to travel again. Maybe I always want to wear a mask now, but now I worry that people will judge me because they think that either I'm not vaccinated or they're going to judge me because I'm still wearing a mask and they don't think that I should be anymore, right? And I see a lot of this also within families and within communities, right? What if I have family members that choose not to receive a vaccine, and I don't want to I don't want to bring my kids around them. Maybe I don't want to visit them. But now, since things are opening back up, people are feeling comfortable with traveling and having gatherings. What will the holidays look like, right? What will just milestone events that typically a lot of people gather for, if there is that anxiety, right, that was mentioned before, that re-emerging anxiety, that can cause some tension and some rifts within families, within communities, within cultural settings. And so again, just knowing that like that's not over, and that will continue for a long time, and also just processing the ramification of one's losses and traumatic experiences. A lot of the pandemic was just adrenaline, just going, just trying to keep up, trying to see what's next, trying to survive, quite frankly. And now, once that immediate threat may be removed, this may be the time where a lot of people are like, this was a really big deal for me, and for my family and for my community and for, again, my cultural beings and identities. And I need time to process that loss and any potential trauma that arose because of it. And a last part, just again, maintaining that self-advocacy of how can I, things that, institutions, employers were easily accommodating for this past year. How do I keep up with that? Knowing that some of those accommodations did work for me, and I want to maintain that. And I want to advocate for myself moving forward. And that is all that I have.
Thank you so much. I think we may have temporarily lost Dr. Kosit. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome David Fireman to join us for the next section. See if we can get him here. There he is.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to have been invited to this panel and to contribute to the larger discussion that we're having today about COVID, grief, and stress. And I just want to thank Jillian for that really excellent presentation on the cultural and the social aspects of what we're going through here. It seems to me in many ways, socially, our grief is and will be germinating along the very same societal cracks that the pandemic has exploited and has exposed. And all of this against a very grim background of other rolling tragedies, such as the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many other Black people by police officers, a record wildfire season, the storming of the Capitol, the Texas power crisis, mass shootings in Atlanta. The list goes on and on. Some people thinking of this as a kind of cascading collective set of traumas for all of us to one degree or another. So I just want to make mention of how important it is to bear in mind the social and the cultural aspects of what we're all going through. From my perspective as a social worker dealing mainly in the clinical realm with clients, individual clients, couples, groups, and families, I'm thinking of social work as having basically two pillars. One being personal transformation, the individual work, helping the individual change and make positive changes in attitudes and behaviors. And the other pillar being social justice, where we advocate and work with the systemic problems and partner up and network to do that kind of work through our political activism and our professional organizations, et cetera. Both those pillars make up social work. And it's through our therapeutic alliance, I believe, that we can, the prism and the vehicle of that therapeutic alliance, the connection that we make with our clients, that we can, through pragmatic caring, affect those changes in both the individual and hopefully in our larger social systems. I think of the Hokusai, the great Japanese painter, and his great wave off Kanagawa that he painted in 1831. That image has become iconic, and you can find it on socks now, and briefs for that matter. If you look at that image very closely, you'll see this gigantic, almost monstrous looking wave. In the background, of course, Mount Fuji. But if you study the print block closer, you'll see that in and among the smaller waves, there are longboats with people in them. And they are doing whatever they possibly can do to navigate and negotiate the tremendous force of that tsunami. And I think that really is an apropos image of what we are facing now. I think the grief wave is here, if you will. In some sense has always been here, of course, because as we love in life, we also lose in life. But now in a way that I don't think any of us could have anticipated. Certainly in my living memory, I have never been faced with such profound issues, daily issues in terms of redefining and restructuring my work, my family life. It just goes on and on. And so grief as the barely survivable human experience is here. And the question is, how do we move through it in the best and the most optimal way? And together. From a clinical perspective, I'm looking at how to be optimally responsive to the bereaved. And that isn't going to be too different in essence from how I'm going to work with people who are not dealing with acute losses. And yet very different in some specific ways. As we know, there are so many very different forms of loss, not just loss through death. But when it comes to the pandemic, we are talking about so many thousands. I believe the number is upward of 600,000 in this country alone of COVID-related deaths. And so we are talking about the specific loss of death and how we can cope with that kind of loss. And it's really through empathic immersion and optimal responsiveness that we as helpers and me as a therapist can dwell as best as possible in the intensities surrounding death and dying and our grief and mourning processes. So I wanted to define grief and mourning and do so in a way that both highlights the macro and the micro views of the social work perspective that I've been talking about. First of all, I believe that grief and mourning are non-pathological healing processes. Now, while there may be some ways in which some individuals become frozen and stuck in a kind of prolonged grief disorder circumstance, and I'll address that in a little while. Grief and mourning really are spontaneous, natural healing processes. And we go through grief because we love. And I'd just like to read a definition that I thought was very heartwarming by a writer, Elizabeth Gilbert, who examines grief in her writing. She was also, if you're interested, interviewed by Chris Anderson on the inaugural episode of the TED Interviews podcast. She's reflecting on the death of her partner, Raya Elias, her longtime friend, who died of terminal cancer. She says, grief happens upon you. It's bigger than you. There is a humility that you have to step into, where you surrender to being moved through the landscape of grief by grief itself. And it has its own time frame. It has its own itinerary with you. It has its own power over you. and it will come when it comes. And when it comes, it's a bow down, it's a carve out. And it comes when it wants to, and it carves you out. It comes in the middle of the night, comes in the middle of the day, comes in the middle of a meeting, comes in the middle of a meal. It arrives. It's this tremendously forceful arrival, and it cannot be resisted without you suffering more. The posture that you take is you hit your knees in absolute humility, and you let it rock you until it is done with you. And it will be done with you eventually. And when it is done, it will leave. But to stiffen, to resist, and to fight is to hurt yourself. I think that rather stark and compelling piece of writing is exactly accurate in terms of the grief process, a poetic way of talking about it. In a more clinical way, grief is the acute anguish, bodily, cognitive, emotional, social, and spiritual, that occurs after a loss or a separation. Mourning, on the other hand, is the long, winding journey or road that we take of accommodating to the loss. And mourning involves redefining and reconstructing oneself in relation to the self, in relation to the deceased, and in relation to the world. And that process really is, I think, in the context of clinical work, best helped along with an experience near perspective, meaning that we privilege the client's experience, the subjective experience of the client, over theories, over schools of thought. It's not that we don't bring those theories and schools of thought to bear upon the conversation and within the conversation, but we do want to, as best as possible, privilege the client's subjective experience through empathic immersion to help as best as possible. I'm also wanting to talk a bit about, and if you could please change the slide, thank you, our assumptive world. Our assumptive world is basically the taken for granted reality that we all share in. It's the predictability and the security and the protection that we feel when things are going along, and we can assume that they're going along just as they always have. We basically have the belief in a benevolent world, although that benevolence can be shattered. Certainly, if you watch the news, you can see how often that benevolence is shattered. And certainly as a result of the pandemic, our very basic foundational beliefs about reality have been shaken. And this sudden plunge into an awareness of death can lead to, certainly does lead to the suffering, but can also lead to and prompt a process of life review and introspection. And so many emotions are marshaled in that process. And perhaps there are lessons to be learned for all of us as we move forward. But we need the power of a witness, and that comes through community, much like this conference in its recognition of the loss of Kate Mahoney. We come together, we witness, we remember. And in so doing, we confirm and protect our grief from fading into nothingness. And I believe at bottom, that is precisely what happens in the therapeutic context. Grief is prolonged when we put it off or push it down or give it away. And as was mentioned, we fall into the trap of hierarchies of grief and rankings of grief. We validate certain kinds of grief, we invalidate other kinds of grief. That is not only unfair, but it is inaccurate. Grief is profoundly subjective. It is experienced extremely personally. But there are risks for prolonged grief. And in fact, some of the language coming out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5R, I believe we're at now, the language has been shifting over time to recognize more deeply and more accurately some of the core grief symptoms that get constellated in a prolonged grief disorder reaction. Those core grief symptoms include an unabating longing or yearning to be with the dead, and an unabating preoccupation with the dead. This is in spite of time, in spite of inner work, in spite of all kinds of supports. This is an unabating kind of grief reaction, a frozenness or a suspended animation, if you will, and so associated with high risk. And this is where the question of pathology does come up, where grief and mourning are in fact non-pathological healing processes. This is an instance where I think as clinicians we have to begin to dig in and ask more pointed questions in order to help in the best way. Other risks that are associated with prolonged grief disorder or complicated bereavement is the death of a child. Losses that are preventable or perceived as preventable, losses that are violent and sudden, and former living relationships that were characterized by ambiguity and ambivalence and conflict. Those sorts of circumstances, social and familial, also contribute to a prolonged grief situation. Now, practically everybody during COVID has dealt with some form of loss, whether it was death or not. But those who did experience loss through death are at risk for prolonged grief because of these risk factors, including being cut off from the customary grief rituals, bedside goodbyes, funerals, burials, etc. These rituals and ways of human beings connecting throughout time have helped us to get through what is barely a survivable experience, and help us to contain and share in our grief together, and witness together what we're going through. So what we have in the COVID circumstance is virtually every death that has occurred now moving forward seems to me to be there are risk elements for a prolonged grief disorder circumstance. Just one case example, very brief, of someone I'm working with who has dual citizenship, and she was unable to get to her loved one on time before he died, and she was raised by this man. He was a great mentor to her, a grandfather figure, and she, in essence, was cut off because of border circumstances and whatnot during the peak of COVID, was cut off from her ability to say goodbye to her grandfather. She is now reaching out for help and finally able to begin thawing out, if you will, begin getting some movement going on, that sense of suspended animation in terms of her feelings about what had occurred. And really the thing that comes out the most, at least at this point, is that she put off her grief. She deferred her grief. And she also believed, because she's a very sensitive soul, that her grief was not as important as the grief of others surrounding her in her locality. She had friends and family who lost loved ones to COVID. And she thought that she would have to put off her grief and in some sense push it down. And now, thankfully, she's reaching out for help so that she can get through and beneath the surface and the crust of her defenses. against the attack of losing her grandfather. And so we can see that that loss and grief can also help a person generate new possibilities in terms of redefining themselves. Now, this often takes a long time in grief work, but there are many people who are able to not only restore a sense of themselves again over time and hard work, but also do some personal transformation and redefinition of themselves. So when I use the term regressive restoration, I'm not meaning to sound negative about that. I think we all regress in stressful circumstances, but the point of redefinition is one that some people begin to submit to after a time. They can no longer do it the same way. They can no longer think about their life in the same manner, and so undergo what is essentially a reconstruction process of their life. This is in relationship to themselves and their values, and in relationship to the deceased, where the core of the grief experience and the mourning process is to somehow find a way to stay connected to the deceased, rather than to be cut off, or as was once suggested in our field, to deconnect from the love object. We know now that the heart of the grief and mourning process is to try to find a way, perhaps it's spiritual, if one is inclined in that direction, perhaps it's psychological, but it is an interior experience. It's an experience of finding a way to stay connected to the deceased, and in fact, to continue to have a certain kind of dialogue and an internalization process of the values and the memories of that individual. And so that is the redefinition process. I also wanted to talk some, and some of my points here are not found on the slides, but I have a way of wanting to riff off of these ideas, I suppose. Open and closed narratives. This is an idea by Joy Weisel Barth that I ran into in a study group in an article. And what she talks about is the difference between closed and open narratives. Now, a closed narrative has the feeling of fixedness and stuckness and intractability. It's stultifying to growth and change. And perhaps most importantly, it forecloses future possibilities and visions. Whereas an open narrative is more nuanced and complex. It's flexible, it's open to possibility. And it does not foreclose future visions. In fact, it's open to dreams. It's open to texture. And so this is just another way of thinking about how we work with our clients and with ourselves, for that matter, is to notice what narratives we are telling ourselves about our life. To the extent that we are authors of our own life, we want, as best as possible, to move from closed narratives to open narratives. One of my clients who lost his special needs son, is trying his best at this point, after having lost not just his son, but the entire world order that he wove around, along with his wife, his special needs son, the world order, the daily habits, the caretaking, the absolute commitment to raising a special needs boy. After a loss, it's like that. The idea of reconstructing one's life is profoundly challenging. But that said, with a lot of courage, and I would say a lot of boldness and in his own right, eagerness to try to reconstruct his life while not letting go of his son. He is now entering another phase of playing his favorite sport again. Back on the field, doing the best he can, a little older now, but back trying again. And I think as small and insignificant as that might seem in the vast scheme of things, for him, it is a terribly important move to make as he continues to mourn and try to open the narrative for himself as he moves forward. I want to say a few more things in relationship to managing uncertainty and precariousness. Of course, this is the issue that encompasses all of our concerns about COVID stress and grief. And that is, can we live within our current uncertainty and precariousness while our capacity to cope has been injured? We know that the vulnerability or that the experience of vulnerability often marshals automatic and in many instances unconscious defense systems. We experience loss as an attack on the self, and we become very fortified in reaction to that attack. And we lose touch with the vulnerable aspects because they're so painful to endure. But I think we do so at our peril, as I've been suggesting, that we have to find ways to not just endure, but to open up. And as Gilbert points out, to let the grief experience come through like a tsunami, and to submit to it, and not to resist it, and not to resist the process as much as we possibly can. And I think as helpers, what we bring is not just what we do, but what we are. And the qualities of optimal responsiveness that resonate for me, outlined by an author named Perlitz. He identifies 8 qualities of optimal responsiveness. One is analytic hope. And this is an antidote to despair. It's not a Pollyanna, everything is or will be fine, but it's a hard look at despair and sitting in despair. And also as the clinician, as the therapist, offering a certain kind of analytic hope or hopefulness in the relationship. Emotional connection and even affection, oftentimes affection really for clients, and privileging the client over theory, holding our theories lightly, and really listening deeply into the unique and idiosyncratic experience of our clients. Also being willing to be wrong. This is a fallibilistic approach. This is being able, having the capacity to not have it right all the time, and to, in fact, submit to being corrected. Having a non-judgmental stance, especially in client situations that bring forward big differences between our value systems and our beliefs, and that may in fact these days come into the realm of politics, where we're being presented with a very different viewpoint from our own. Avid curiosity about the client's experiences and their own biography, and tolerance for ambiguity, being able to sit with the uncertainty and be within the zone of discomfort, of not knowing, of not having all the answers, but to have the capacity to sit with and in the profound loss circumstance. And of course, universally, just the compassion for a fellow human sufferer. I would add a sense of realistic positivity. I mentioned not being Pollyanna about some of the more confusing and dark aspects of our humanity, to be able to acknowledge those darknesses, those confusions, that rage. Also to cultivate as best as possible a non-anxious presence. And that, I think, really depends on our capacity to have some comfort with silence and stillness. And lastly, to encourage rituals that help to contain the intense emotions of loss and express them in a way that feels ordered and non-chaotic. And I often will encourage clients to tailor make their own rituals and have collaborations with them about doing so. Finally, I want to end on a note of respecting grief and hope. I think that grief is the wave that we are experiencing now and will experience to greater or lesser degrees. Knowing that and respecting it will set the stage for moving forward, for accepting as best as we can our losses, learning from them, and mourning them. And the mourning process leads back to life. And finally, on the theme of hope, again, not sunny narrative, not everything is or will be fine, but perhaps a counter narrative that everything is dark and disordered. Hope is about broad perspectives. Getting this from Rebecca Solnit, who is a philosopher and writes about hope very, very beautifully. Hope is about broad perspectives, she says, that demand and invite action. Hope is an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So thank you to our panelists and experts. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. So if we can be back at 11:35 Central Time. And then when we return, we'll then hear from Michael, who will share his personal perspective living with COVID. So during the break, we'd ask if you would please make sure that for panelists and everybody, you're muted and stop your video, and we will see you in 10 minutes. Have a good restful break. if we can start reconvening back from break, we'd appreciate it. Questions have come in about if the slides will be made available, and they will. Danielle and our staff will make sure that the PowerPoint presentation is accessible to everyone. All right, we'll give it about another 30 seconds and letting people return from their well-earned break. And then we'll have Michael begin. We hope that everyone is gaining valuable information, and we're grateful to all of our panelists for being here today. All right, welcome back from break, everyone. And again, I'm Michael Coset, moderator, and we're now going to turn it over to Michael Catania, who is going to share the direct impact of COVID on himself and his family and his interactions with his medical providers. So you can begin, Michael. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to present a sort of a narrative of these issues as we go forward. They'll reflect the information that you see on your slide, but I'm not going to go through the slide points one at a time. They'll be covered in the narrative that I'm going to provide. One of the ideas I'd like to present up front and sort of have people thinking about is what I would call proximate grief, which is what my family suffered, because initially they were informed I might not survive the COVID illness. And then it was a matter of days of hearing updated messages and new information. And it was always right there on the edge that, you know, this might be the call. And that kind of stress related to that is what really most of what I want to talk about relates to. My eldest son, Martin, took on the task of coordinating and disseminating information while I was hospitalized. He had the task of being the point person for the hospital contact so that my wife, Chris, didn't have to deal so directly with the bad news coming pretty fast and daily for the first few days. He would filter the information and disseminate a version that was accurate without having every message turn into a flurry of phone calls that my wife would have to deal with from concerned relatives or friends. He used Facebook, and as a result, his entire circle of friends, many of whom I were from his childhood and people I knew as well, were kept informed and involved. This is a responsibility I do not envy anyone having to perform, and he did it very well. It was important for me to recognize the impact this had on my son, my other children, my grandchildren, and my extended family. In the intervening time between my illness and my recovery and now, I've had a brother, a daughter, a grandson, and an aunt all contract COVID, none of them hospitalized, all of them in varying degrees of illness. The aunt, the last surviving of her generation, had a mild case, was kept overnight just for observation, but she's been sent home and is doing fine. But let me be clear about this disease, because I contracted it in the first half of March of 2020. And no one really knew where it came from or what it was at that point. There was a lot of discussion about it, but nobody was providing any legitimate or solid information that could be counted upon. I hadn't been anywhere. I hadn't done anything exotic. I hadn't seen or met people that I knew to be from places that had been affected or that had been announced in the news as affected. And at the time, I was pretty oblivious. I actually thought I had a bad cold that I just couldn't shake. It never occurred to me that I might be a victim of this novel virus that they were talking about in the news. Among other treatments that I received once I was hospitalized, I was given hydroxychloroquine to no known positive or negative effect, fortunately. We were still in the early phases of understanding and developing treatments for COVID, and we were in the sort of throw it at the wall and see what sticks phase. To this day, I have no idea how I got the disease. All the reasons for why I was susceptible made it feel like it was my fault. I'm overweight, I have diabetes. These things are explanatory to a degree, but none of them helps with the stress of trying to understand why you are where you are. They do help make you feel guilty, however. I believe most of the early patients were pretty much in the same boat. They just didn't know what they had done to more or less to deserve this outcome. The topic of vaccination wouldn't even come up for 6 months. I was a skeptic when it did finally come up, and I did a lot of reading and discussing to get comfortable with the concept. Dr. Akbarnia, my ER doctor, was a very great help to me during that period of time. Next slide, please. I thought I was going in for a nebulizer treatment on March 23rd. I'd had such a treatment a week earlier, and my doctor had sent me for another. I drove myself to the hospital, walked in under my own power, and disappeared from my family for the next 15 days. For the first 8 days, I was intubated. My relationship with my ER doctor, Dr. Akbarnia, began on my first day in the hospital. Apparently, there was a discussion between me and the ER doctor about the need to be intubated. I was the first at Condell Medical Center to undergo this procedure for COVID-19 treatment. I do not remember any of that. I'm told by her that I was a very supportive patient for a procedure she didn't want to perform and I didn't want to have. You may remember at that time the success rate for intubation was low, but it was often the patient's last and best chance. I was in very rough condition, according to Dr. Akbarnia on her Facebook post, and I'm quoting her here. We had to decide how long we would try to let him work through the low oxygen state before needing to intubate him. His levels kept falling, and despite our best efforts, it was time to put him on the ventilator. He told us he didn't feel great about this, but Doc, he said, I trust you and I'm putting myself in your hands. That uneasy feeling in my stomach grew even more in that moment, but he, with his teacher's steady voice, kept me grounded where I was supposed to be. I saw his eyes looking at me, seeing the kindness in them, even as we pushed the medications to put him to sleep. As I've said, I have no recollection of any of this exchange, except what she provides me with in her description. This is, I believe, still available on Facebook under her name, Akbarnia, Akbarnia, if anyone wants to look for it. I'm told it went viral, and a lot of people that have contacted me in the intervening year have referred to that post and to how well she wrote a description of what took place between the two of us. My first recollection of her came from the second or third day following extubation. So I was intubated for 8 days, then they took the tubes out, and about 2 or 3 days later, I had my first face-to-face meeting with her, if you can call it that. I think we were both wearing masks for that meeting. She asked me if I recognized her, and I said I recognized her eyes, but beyond that, I had no real memory. She told me who she was and why she was there. She said she'd written the post for Facebook and wanted my permission to post it. I encouraged her to read it to me, and following that, I asked if she thought it might help people getting treated or people treating those individuals to do their jobs and to take the treatments that were necessary. And she felt very strongly that it would help. And my position at that time was anything I can do to help anybody who had anything to do with my survival, I was all in. So I gave my enthusiastic support to it for all of those reasons, and because this was the person who got me through the worst of the process. There were so many others who contributed to my survival, and I never met most of them. I know that they were there because I saw their names on the Medicare explanation of benefits report that detailed quite a few individuals. I wanted then and continue to want now to do whatever I can do to support them in their work. They're all contributors to my being here today. And this is one way for me to actually do something that says thanks to that group of individuals. On a practical level, I wanted to do something more concrete for the workers and staff that had been serving me on the unit where I was confined. There's nothing more humiliating or dehumanizing than being completely 100% at the mercy of a group of other individuals that you don't know and have never met. And that's where I was for at least the first 10 days, and I think probably a little beyond that. By the time I was released from the hospital, I was 50 pounds lighter than I was when I went in. I could not actually walk. I could stand and move a couple of steps with a walker, but that was about it. And I had to go home on oxygen. Next slide, please. Beyond the medical, however, there was another whole layer of individuals who rarely get discussed in any detail. The family members, significant others, colleagues, and friends that form every human being's circle of community or communities within which they function. In my case, I was and am humbled by the number and diversity of communities from which I derive support and comfort. I should note that Facebook is not among them. I am not a user by choice. However, much of my support came from those who do use it and who view posts from others who use it. As a result, the great number of people I have as friends, worked with, or in some way came to know over the years became aware of my story. And for that, I have to thank Facebook. Let me discuss 3 communities briefly, of which I am a willing member here: family, work, and what I'll refer to as interpersonal. I'm a married father of 5 children, grandfather to 10, and uncle to dozens, and I have 4 brothers and 4 sisters. My wife, Chris, of 47 years next week, was chief among those bearing the brunt of my illness. She was quarantined at our home for the term of my hospitalization, since she had been with me for the 2 weeks or so that I had been coughing as I sat across from her prior to hospitalization. As it turned out later, she tested positive for antibodies and was an asymptomatic victim. When I got home after 15 days away from her, she was rewarded with another 2-week quarantine, as was I. However, since I was on oxygen, connected by a 45-foot air tube and unable to walk very far, and then only with a walker, we weren't going anywhere anyway, or at least I wasn't. She couldn't, as a result. Until I got rid of the oxygen consolidator device, which was about the size of a medium suitcase and very heavy, I was tethered to it even at night, since I wore the tubes to bed. I ended up in my recliner most nights for a good long while. The tubes, the nose piece, the compressor humming in the background, that plus the doctor's orders to stay apart as much as possible does wonders for intimacy, let me tell you. At Thanksgiving, about 7 months following my hospitalization, I sent an email to my immediate family. I knew we would not be getting together for the usual gathering, nor were we likely to do so at Christmas. And I wanted them to know how thankful I was for them, especially in this year of such difficult time my illness had presented. It was more important for me to recognize the impact this had had on them. In the intervening time, an older brother had gotten the mild case. My eldest daughter, Stephanie, had a pretty severe case, but was not hospitalized, and her youngest child, Lincoln, also had a mild case. Then I heard my 98-year-old aunt, last surviving of her generation, had a mild case also. The work community. I'm a retired teacher, have hundreds of school district faculty and staff that I have worked with over my 40-plus year career in education. Many of these folks came forward with well wishes expressed through our shared retirement community, as well as in direct letters and cards wishing me well and offering support. Almost all had read about my story as published by Dr. Akbarnia on her Facebook page. And if you Google her and COVID-19, you should be able to find the story. Interpersonal, the interpersonal community. This is consists mostly of former students. And these are students that were students of mine in the behavior disordered, emotionally disturbed programs that I worked in over the years. They've maintained contact over the years. They've graduated, moved on, but still keep in touch. Many of them sent cards, letters, and even visited me at my home. they'd pull in at the end of the driveway and wave to me, or, call me and tell me they were out there, and then wave to me from the end of the driveway. I would have to go out to make them see that I was okay and still with them. So we went through that ritual several times. Many still call and stay in touch even to today, and have over the past year. I'd like to take just a minute to talk about silver linings for COVID. I have a 100% blocked right coronary artery that would have been undiscovered had it not been for COVID-19. As a result of difficulties I had during the process in the ER, they examined the functioning of my heart and discovered this problem, and were able to place a stent last summer that doesn't take care of the 100% blockage, but provides sufficient blood to the part of the heart that was affected, so that I'm still with us and still functioning. My youngest daughter collaborated with her siblings and purchased a Fitbit for me, a Fitbit Sense. It monitors exercise, heart rate, blood oxygen, sleep, and many other functions, so I can stay on top of the data and provide it to my doctors. I'm very grateful for my many blessings: spouse, children, grandchildren, extended family, friends, colleagues, former students, a multifaceted career, and I am painfully aware of my good fortune as compared to so many others who don't have any or few of these kinds of supports available to them as they fight the same battle I fought, and may or may not be equally as successful in overcoming. The ability I will have to re-engage with my retirement community as a substitute teacher, still having something to offer, is a goal that I have as part of this silver linings process. I used to, up until the time I got COVID, I was a retired teacher serving as a substitute. I had a gig to be a long-term substitute that was destroyed by COVID, both the fact that I had it and the fact that the school ended up closing. So the focus for me at this point is developing a greater level of empathy and understanding for those who still struggle with the many aspects of COVID, and that COVID continues to divide our society, as we've discussed tangentially earlier in other presentations. Finding ways to help with time, money, goods, etc., for those with less resources is a goal of mine, and coming to a better understanding of long COVID. People suffer from migraines, fatigue, aches, pains, joint problems, muscle issues, heart difficulties, mysterious infections with no identifiable cause, and the list goes on. And we're learning more each day. We still have a long way to go for us to fully understand this disease and its long-term ramifications. I am glad to be as much a part of that process as I can. I've offered myself, and my wife has also offered herself, as subjects in a long-term study to help identify antibody levels and their continued fluctuations, so that we have a great understanding of the ongoing impact, or a better understanding of the ongoing impact of COVID. I appreciate the opportunity to have presented this information to you. I'm not sure how valuable it is for anyone, but if it has any value at all, that's a contribution that I can make, and I'm willing to make, and happy to do so. Thank you very much, and I turn it back to the moderator.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. So as I just put in the chat box, if individuals would, if you have questions either for the panel in general or for a specific panelist, if you would just put that in the chat box right now, and Danielle and Ashley can help us with that. So while we're allowing the questions to come in from attendees, we can just open this up for all the panelists. So we've certainly, and Dr. Bluford, you talked about the cultural barriers and the disparities. What can we do from a cultural perspective to help even those disparities and help reduce those disparities as we're moving forward and coming out of COVID? So whether it's related to grief or mental health access, medical access, stress, for any of the panelists, what can we do to help reduce the disparities among individuals from different cultures when it comes to COVID and treatment? any panelist who wants to chime in.
Yeah, I can jump in, and then would love to hear others' insight as well. I mean, I think a big part of it is just having that awareness that even if you're in a space with someone, all parties are bringing in their cultural experiences, and just taking the time to either bracket, compartmentalize like our own stuff to learn about someone else's, and to not make assumptions, and to really just to hear their stories, what struggles, what do they really need, and then that's where I see the advocacy can come in, right? How can I use some of my identities and power and privileges to support communities that just haven't been able to have their voices amplified? But first, I have to do the homework and hear from these communities first, and then really can be able to address something that is actually a problem, something that they actually need, and not just what I may believe that they need.
I would just like to add, if I could, that we really need to dispense with the idea of grief hierarchies and rankings. As I mentioned earlier, in my part, an author by the name of Harvey Peskin talks about this. And he said that grief is most our own when we protest its being taken away from us. I think that really is profound, and it gets back to the idea that we need to witness one another openly, because that confirms and protects the experience from fading into denial or into nothingness. And from there, I think we do our best on the advocacy and political activism side, and networking and partnership side, to really be present for people from other ways and walks of life.
Thank you, David. I think it's also really important. I just heard, reviewed 2 articles that were, on social media about stress, anxiety that people are going through with the idea of going back into the world of work, going back to school. And so I think we have to be compassionate and recognizing that, just as, again, we talked about earlier, people grieve differently. There's going to be a range of experiences with regarding returning to work, returning to school, returning to quote unquote normal functioning. Some people will be very eager to go back to work and go back in the office, and other people may have significant stress and anxiety because of that. So I think for those in decision-making roles to be sensitive to that. One of the articles I read talked about the millennial generation now is, not eager necessarily to just jump right back in, that they have been working remotely and being able to be at home and being with their pets and things like that at the same time while getting their work done. So I think, again, we have to look at these intergenerational kind of differences, and how do we transition back in a way that is safe, that alleviates people's anxieties and stress, and is supportive of people. So anyway. One of the questions is, I was very interested to hear Dr. Bluford's thoughts about employers and the time we give grief and loss. What suggestions do you have for employers on working with employees who are experiencing grief and loss?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think highlights, again, a lot of employers, we have a very short bereavement leave policy, but what happens in this case where, we have experienced a lot of loss, right? And again, it doesn't have to be that death-related loss of immediate family member, where I usually see most of the bereavement leave policies come in. And so I think this can be a great time for one, though, so you have the capacity and power to revisit those policies, to do so, but more so, and similar to what Michael was saying, to really are we listening to our employees? Are we listening to our students and staff members and faculty and colleagues that are both excited and or are bringing a lot of stuff with them, right? And even when we are at a space where a lot of places are back to in-person capacity and things feel like they were before, a lot of people are carrying grief with them. A lot of anniversary dates and holidays and a lot of just milestones will be taking place, and that's often when we think about our losses the most, right? And the people that are that may not be here with us, or the memories that we didn't get to to have ourselves. And so how can we, one on the like, systematic policy side, really revisit that and what we think the grieving process looks like, but also on just the like relationship humanity side, give folks a space to either process their grief or not. But how do we also make sure that there's not the same demands and the same like work ethic and pressure just to keep going and going and going? You know, how do we let some of that go, right? And I think about my experience as a faculty member in academia and like and how that's, you know, a nonstop circle and wheel. And the pandemic has really brought to the forefront of like how much expectations do we need to put on people right now, and how can we adjust that to be realistic to what they're really dealing with. And so how do we not forget that piece when, you know, cases are next to zero, and again it feels like we're back to where we were.
You know, to build on what Jillian talked about, I think for managers, supervisors to work with HR to, again, redesign bereavement policies. You know, if we look at it from a cultural perspective, also in some cultures, you might have someone who is a next door neighbor, but is like a grandmother figure to a person or a parental figure. And so, but if bereavement policies are so rigid that say it can only be immediate family members, a partner, spouse, children, parents, things like that. So if someone has experienced a loss because, you know, of, again, somebody who's a neighbor, an HR department or a supervisor may judge that and say, well, that's not an appropriate, you're not eligible for a bereavement leave because they don't fit the immediate family criteria. But for that person, that is an immediate family member, even though it is a neighbor or an aunt, or it may not be a blood relation. So those kind of things are important. But I would also encourage HR departments and other places of work and school to provide debriefing, like groups and processes where employees can just, even over coffee or, you know, casual conversations, talk about what it's like transitioning back, exploring difficulties, whether it's with childcare or other types of individuals as well. Again, going back to what David talked about, is, you know, reducing the hierarchy around grief. Briefly, in my years in teaching my grief counseling class, I lecture on pet loss, and I've had students who say, "Why are we wasting time talking about pet loss?" And clearly, those individuals are probably those who've never had a pet. And I've had students in the class who've said, "You know, my pet loss was more impactful for me than even when a relative died, because, you know, that pet was unconditional love and support and got me through challenging times." So again, if a pet, we don't offer bereavement leave for a pet loss, but a pet loss for some individuals could be the, you know, like a child and things like that. So again, putting that in perspective.
Yeah.
Other
Michael,
panelists' perspectives. Oh, go ahead.
If I could just say one more comment about regarding just HR, and again, you know, even as COVID cases dwindle, doesn't mean that those who have been exposed or contracted, that their symptoms have fully eradicated either, right? So I know quite a few people that are still dealing with symptoms and were diagnosed with COVID last year. And so how also can we, and that's a loss in itself, right, of someone's health status and just their mobility and ability to function. And so how do we also be accommodating to that as well?
Well, that kind of leads to the third question for the panelists, and I'd open it up to other panelists as well. What do you believe is the long-term impact of grief and loss on children, adolescents, and adults because of COVID-19? And how do we, as grief professionals, work with those folks? So any thoughts from the panelists?
Well, just a larger point about grief and American culture. We tend to feel that grief is un-American somehow, and that the focus is on getting back to business as usual as quickly as possible. And in many instances, we don't have managers or human resource personnel who reach out for help or do their own work. But that is increasing. I've been heartened to see that many people, and representing various companies and whatnot, do in fact reach out for help and consultation. And we've been involved in some of those efforts. As far as children, it's only in the last 50 years that we as a collective have recognized that children actually grieve. It's just that children grieve differently from adults. They tend to do it in a piecemeal fashion. Need to really pay attention to their behavioral cues rather than what they're able to verbalize. And depending on their cognitive developmental level, the interventions will change and have to be tailor-made. So I think it depends, first of all, on the environment in which they find themselves, family, school, wider cultural spheres of influence that allows for the recognition that they grieve and that they have feelings about their loss, and that they can express their feelings about their loss in an open and non-judgmental way. For younger children, in fact, for all children, to some degree or another, it's not uncommon for them to feel that somehow they were the cause of the death. And that being the case, it's just extraordinarily important for adults and other listeners to intervene at that point. And all else is open for questioning and for discussion. But that kind of self-referential blame needs to be addressed quite quickly to nip it in the bud, I believe. So with that said, I think just on a larger, broader basis, we need to recognize that children do grieve and that they grieve differently from adults, and that in our schools and in our families and our religious institutions, we really need to bring to bear the best kind of witnessing practices as possible to help them along in their process.
I'd like to add a comment, if I might, on that topic. As a teacher working with the behavior disordered and emotionally disturbed students for most of the 50-year period that was just referenced, I can tell you for a fact that that whole attitude has changed over time, but it still has a long way to go for it to get to the place where people are comfortable with the idea of how we treat, especially adolescents. Most of my career has focused on adolescents because much of their response is acting out behavior. And so they're immediately off-putting. And getting a group to support a student suffering a loss as an adolescent who's acting out is really difficult to do. And that is an area that needs lots of additional attention, in my opinion.
One of the questions about how we can work with children, especially when they hear things in the news and feeling stressed, and what can we look for? One of the things that I do, and again I include it in my grief class, is bibliotherapy, and which is the therapeutic use of books. So there are many wonderful children's picture books now that deal with a variety of grief and loss issues. I would imagine that if they're not already out there, that there are children's handouts, worksheets, things that address the grief in the pandemic or stress in the pandemic. So I think just doing a Google search, would come up with things. But the important things with working with grieving children is to try to maintain rituals and normalcy as much as possible. So especially in the immediacy of say a death or other type of loss, trying to make sure bedtime is as much close to what they're used to as possible. Bedtime stories, end of evening rituals, things like that can help give some constancy to kids. And to David's point, kids grief in spurts. So you could have a child who is crying, very emotional, and 2 minutes later, they're immediately, the tears stop and they're like, can I go out and play? And so for caregivers, that could be maybe off-putting. They were grieving 1 minute and literally now they are, ready to go play and have fun. Someone put in the chat, the movie Coco is amazing. Yeah, Coco, the Pixar movie Coco not only talks about children's grief, but also is also great for cultural aspects of grief. Jillian mentioned the National Alliance for Grieving Children. A service, a program that have been involved in is Comfort Zone Camp. I'll put that in the chat. It's the nation's largest bereavement camp for kids age 7 to 17. And I've been a volunteer grief therapist with that organization. And that's a free service to children and families throughout the country. and there's numerous camps in different parts of the country. But anyway, so I think there's definitely a lot of resources out there for children, but just normalizing the experience. I'll share, early on during COVID, I had an acquaintance on Facebook, and every day for probably like over 80 days, he posted like a COVID challenge. And one day he made homemade pasta, and learning yoga and all these things. And I felt horrible about myself. I'm like, I can barely get out of bed, and here is this guy doing all these amazing things. And I felt a lot of shame. I felt guilty. I'm like, well, what's the matter with me? And then I had to stop and I had to say, okay, he is coping with COVID the best way he knows how. I don't have to make homemade pasta. I don't have to do yoga. If I got out of bed and that's my accomplishment for the day and connecting with people, then that's great. So, and I think we have to do that as we're transitioning back to, again, quote unquote, normalcy, recognizing we have limits, recognizing that the grief and the stress is not going to go away just because we are vaccinated and we're going back to work now. So we just have to bring that self-compassion to ourselves. So
if I might just make two further points on children and grief. One is in reference to children being exquisite barometers of their parents' needs, emotional needs. And so they are keyed in and clued in. They can hear the stuff through the walls, and will suspend their own grieving in order to be helpful and to be of service and to be in connection with their parents. So the intervention point, sometimes, maybe more often than not, is actually with the parents as much as with the children, helping the parents learn about children's grief process and helping the parents deal with their own grief, perhaps in other forms and settings, so that they can be of help to their children as they're grieving. And then finally, the role of siblings. I think this is often missed. Surviving siblings. This, in fact, is how our agency began. One of the founders of our agency lost his brother in a hunting accident at the age of 8 years old, and it shattered his childhood. And thankfully, later on in life, after he got his degrees and his education, he founded the Center for Grief Recovery and Sibling Loss, which was one of the first of its kind in this region. And so the role of siblings, surviving siblings, their really experience of grief and mourning is unique in its own right. There's a biological component. See this especially in twins. But the biology of grief is something that we need to take a closer look at. And that's where holding up the sibling and the sibship relationship is extraordinarily important.
Can I just add something to that?
Go ahead.
Thanks. So one of the things I was thinking about is, especially since loss is stressful in itself, I think some of the impact that may have is people's systems, like just like what David was talking about, can be altered, and people may not even realize that. And so just kind of recognizing that this is very different, right? We're in different times right now. And so the body is going to react differently to it as well, and in a way that it's trying to protect itself. And part of that too is, I think, if people don't have the opportunity to process through that in whatever way it is, it can stay in the body, and it can impact how they respond later in life, especially with children and adolescents. A lot of times, especially with children and adolescents not having the socialization capacity that most of us are used to too, that's going to have some long-term effects as well, and can also be very stressful for them and for people around them as well. So I think it's important to look at kind of what is some of the impact of not being able to socialize the way that some of us have been able to socialize in schools, and having some of those rituals of prom and graduation and whatever that may look like, those kind of familiar transitions, and also just kind of looking at how is the cumulative stress of loss and just other demands that are being put on people affecting a person's body and also their thinking and their emotions, because without those being processed through, that can have a long-term impact on some people.
So much, Serena. Eva had a comment. I think adults fear over speaking about loss and often choose to avoid it rather than trying to address it. I would concur with that. In my experience, again, at Comfort Zone Camp as a volunteer grief therapist, I would see this kind of cyclical thing where, as David mentioned, children would hold back their grief because they didn't want to upset their parents. They wanted to protect their parents, so they didn't bring it up. And then the parents conversely would protect their children by not bringing up. So everybody's playing this family systems game of don't talk about grief, don't talk about loss. And so I would always encourage parents that they have to model it, that it's important for parents to, sit their children down and say, mommy's not doing that well. Daddy, is missing mommy, missing grandma, and that tears are okay. What Brene Brown talks about vulnerability, and that is there is actually strength in expressing tears. But people have that myth that, well, if I express tears, I'm showing weakness, but it's actually, the opposite.
But one more thing I just wanted to mention
sure.
with that too, sorry. I think the other piece to it, so as a substance use counselor, that's another piece that I'm seeing a lot of too, is that obviously there's been an increase in substance use, both alcohol and other substances, which can have long-term effects for people. It could change dynamics in a family. It could change, just an individual in and of themselves. And going to this comment that was written just a minute ago, I think part of it is that people are not, they don't feel safe enough to talk about these kinds of things, even though they're necessary to talk about. And substance use has definitely increased through the pandemic. I mean, I've seen a lot of it as a clinician. People have been, looking for ways to moderate now their use or to lessen it. Now that we're opening back up, and there's a lot of fear around that, and substances, are very effective in covering things up, like grief and loss and stress and all those kinds of things. So I think that's the other long-term impact as well, is just kind of looking at, how has different coping mechanisms come about as a result of some of these experiences.
Can we go to the next slide, please? And we'll go to the next set of questions. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just one last point about children. Children are both fragile and extremely resilient, and in many instances want to contribute, want to take part in grief rituals. And so I think we as adults, as parents, need to find sensitive, direct, straightforward ways of talking about loss with children and invite their participation in those rituals.
Thank you so much, David. So let's explore a little bit about what are ways that counselors, therapists, and other helping professionals can serve our communities when dealing with grief and stress as a result of COVID-19. And any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. I think part of that is recognizing that this might be an opportunity to learn different kinds of coping mechanisms and different techniques of managing and regulating oneself. There's some of it's trial and error that needs to happen because, again, a lot of people have not experienced something like this before. And so, previous coping mechanisms, previous ways of processing issues are not going to necessarily work the same with this. So I think part of it is just being able to help clients and, the community members to look at, okay, what are some other ways that we can help manage some of these different things? And so looking for other resources, looking for different techniques to help with these things, looking for different ways to regulate, looking for different ways to connect. I think that's really a big one too, is that a lot of people have felt very disconnected during the pandemic. And so really kind of honing in and how do you reconnect with other people? Because you've been isolated for so long that becomes familiar. And so some of that is just, developing a new skill or developing understanding vulnerability or whatever that may look like. So I think that's also a way to be helpful in terms of managing the stress and, just even healing from some of that too, because a lot of times some of the stress that people experience is really traumatic. And so without it being a healing process, it's going to stay stuck. And so part of it may be really looking at, okay, what do I need in order to heal from this as well? And what does this community need in order to heal from this collectively, and not just individually?
I think that balance between individual and collective grief is really important. So I think, therapists and helping professionals can think about, well, how can we give back, maybe providing some pro bono service and giving a talk at a local library about how to transition back, how to address grief and stress from a family systems, but also a community perspective. Some people may be eager to just jump back in and return to traditional normal activities, but for other people, especially who have pre-existing medical or health conditions, they may not want to jump back in. So I think, not pushing too hard. Some people will want to return to restaurants and be eager to do that, and other people may be very apprehensive and fearful and may kind of stay in their own cocoon. And so gently kind of helping them come out of their shell. But one positive aspect, I think, of COVID is, and I heard this from parents who said, it was great. We played board games and we did jigsaw puzzles and things like that. And my fear is that we will lose those kind of things and people will again be busy about their lives and quickly forget. And, I would hope that we would retain some of those important community and family times together, so why can't we continue the jigsaw puzzle night or the board game night? One of the things that I'm working on a research project on culinary therapy, using cooking as a therapeutic tool. And so during COVID, many people, because they couldn't go to restaurants, had to turn to their kitchen for cooking and baking as a way to cope with stress. And so, as Serena mentioned, tapping into new hobbies, new areas of interest can also help reduce depression and anxiety as well. Any other thoughts from any of the panelists?
Yeah, I was just going to add, just to make sure, and I think this was mentioned earlier, just our own self-care as helping professionals, right? We were not immune from the effects of the global pandemic. And so are we seeking our own potential, therapeutic services, our own support systems, always encouraging students that, we can't be there for others if we're not also there for ourselves. And so before we throw ourselves into serving the community, are we making sure we're taking care of ourselves too?
I think that's an excellent point. So, many of us, again, have been seeing clients and, virtually. And so what is that like to then go back and see, a whole stream of clients face to face? That could be overwhelming. There could be comfort. I've heard a lot of therapists say, it's been really great. I've increased my client load, by seeing people virtually. Well, what does that mean for when now we're all returning in person? So, I think that important aspect of self-care definitely needed.
Yeah, I would just like to piggyback on that. I think it is, of course, really a key point. And it goes back to, it's not just what we do, but what we are. And what we are is largely made up of our practices and what we're paying attention to. So if being in nature, just to take one example, is restorative to your soul, then by all means, I think there was something about taking a walk, as dystopic as it was during the peak. Of course, donning a mask and walking among the trees in the city and seeing the lakefront, and something strange and dazzling about that experience, confusing that we were in the midst of this pandemic and yet the birds were still singing and the waves were still lapping up to the shore. And so there's something about, I think, our relationship to nature and some of our more basic callings to be in touch with the larger forces of the universe, not just our individual relationships in our society, but to the larger forces of nature and the cosmos, etc., that can help many of us stay more grounded and more solid and more centered as we go through hard times.
Can I just make one more comment, please? Really quick, just going back to Michael, what you said earlier about, with the game night with the kids and whatnot. I know one of the things that I've seen with the pandemic is people have kind of reevaluated their values and looking at how they prioritize things. And I know one of the things that, excuse me, has come up is, how people can stay committed to those values so that as things kind of slowly move back into, what was BC before COVID, that they can, stay and still have game night, with their family, or they can see friends a little bit more, or they can commit to volunteering a little bit more, or whatever it is. But that's one of the kind of small silver linings of it. But yet it's been such an impact on clients that I've worked with that, have said that, this has made me realize I don't need to belong to 500 different clubs. I only need one or two. And that way I can establish deeper relationships with people. So I think that is an important point too, is like helping people kind of reevaluate and just kind of explore what's important to them and what they've learned from the whole pandemic, and being able to then figure out how they want to integrate that so that they don't lose it. Because I think, before COVID, a lot of people did not feel very connected with what was important to them. And so this might be that opportunity for that.
Absolutely. So the next question, what resources do you believe are needed to specifically address the unique grief and stress issues from COVID-19? So any panelists' recommendations?
I can just take that for a second.
Sure.
Just, I think specifically really looking at more deeper things that have happened for people. So surface loss is one thing. And I also think that, like with sometimes people, when they lose a job, they lose part of themselves. Their identity is tied with that. And really having to explore that. I don't think there are a lot of ways that people know how to manage that or to kind of re-identify themselves, recreate that. So sometimes it might be resources that help with a deeper sense of issues. It's not just the loss of a job. It goes a little bit more into that. It's not just a loss of somebody. It goes a little bit more underneath that. And so really kind of offering a group or a clinician or, just finding someone that understands that and can help explore that can be helpful.
I think that's such an important point. One of the things we, especially those of us who teach and study grief, there's typically two schools of grief theories. There's the, traditional kind of grief models of separating yourself from the person who died and moving forward, moving on. And then we have what's called postmodern theories, which is how do we establish meaning making? So how do we make meaning as a result of this grief and loss? So for example, maybe people tapped into things that, new aspects of their life that they would not have had COVID never happened. So again, Serena, you mentioned about even again, game night or things like that, the fact that that is a positive. So how do we intentionally as a family, as a person, keep those things going even when we're, opening back up, after COVID. But are there benefits? Are there things that I'm learning and growing as a person as a result of COVID? So for example, in my field, the program that I teach in, we're seeing an upsurge in prospective students applying to the programs, often in a crisis. People want to go back to school. They want to rethink about their life and what they're doing. And so it's an opportunity for people to do some introspective work, and therapists and mental health professionals can support that as people are thinking about themselves, asking those existential type of questions.
Well, I want to jump in. We're getting down to our last minute, but I have to officially thank our moderator, Dr. Michael Kosett, and this wonderful group of panelists. If you've been reading the chat, people are just really eating up everything you're saying. It's helping individuals, it's helping their families. So thank you all. I just want to remind people, you will be getting a link for the APA CEUs, but I would like everyone to go to that link and fill out the evaluation. Even if you don't want CEUs, we'd love to get your feedback on the conference and ideas for future conferences as well. So thank you everyone for being here. Follow us also on social media. I also pasted in the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute website. So for future events and conferences, we hope you'll connect with us there as well. So again, thank you so much. I've learned a ton and I really appreciate everyone coming. So thank you again. And we will have this link available. So we'll get that out to you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think if you could all stay, Danielle, are we stopping the recording now? Let's give her a minute.